You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by
Chrissy Mancini Nichols.
Hey, Chrissy. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, Jeff?
I'm good. I just, first off, I want to say that I kind of apologize to the listeners for being gone for so long after a long absence. I think we haven't been on for 3 weeks or so because I actually took a little vacation up to the Russian River and to get away from work and everything else. So that was super fun, but also there was no show that week, and I apologize because I think I said at the end of the previous show, which was a one-on-one conversation that we shared from the Revolution podcast, but I think I said, "Oh, we'll see you in 2 weeks," and then it's like 4 weeks later, I think. So apologies.
Oh, you need a vacation.
Yeah, in the middle of the summer and all that stuff. So that's good, and hopefully folks are getting this on their podcatchers too, because I know that. I've had some issues with Apple Podcasts, and I know that lots of other people have had issues, and there's articles about it and stuff. So if you want to switch from Apple Podcasts to another podcatcher, there's plenty out there. But Apple has been causing trouble, and it's causing me trouble for listening to other podcasts too. So I don't know if you've had this issue, but
it doesn't Yeah, I noticed it with the new operating system. It doesn't update, or it's weird.
Yeah,
you have to go
it's
find
weird. Well, I will say that
updated.
it gets to your listener numbers too, unfortunately, and a lot of people have had problems with that. So hopefully you're listening, and thank you for that. It's not a lot. It's like a percentage, but you can tell. Like I've seen the numbers go flatter than they have been in the past. So, but everybody here is listening, which is good because you can hear our voices.
Thank you.
But yeah, so we were on a break. But yes, well, what have we been up to in the last month or so, Chrissy?
Doing a lot of gardening, all that fun COVID summer stuff.
Or
yeah.
San Francisco summer stuff.
Yeah, San Francisco summer stuff, gardening in the fog. Yeah, just sort of having a fun summer. That's fun as much as we can, and doing a lot of cycling. And my husband has been making me go on like 30-mile bike rides.
Whoa.
Yeah,
are your legs tired by the end?
I am totally maxed out. He's ready for another 30. So he says that when he bikes with me, it's for love, not for.
Well, that's kind of him.
Yeah,
that's kind.
But it's fun. Yeah, like seeing. I like bike commuting, but actually going out on trails and cycling for biking for fun is it's just like such a great way to see the Bay Area. But
now, do you start out from home, or do you go somewhere?
Usually I start from home.
Yeah,
we have gone up like to Napa and Russian River, Sonoma to bike around there. But I'm used to biking in most cities I've lived that are flat. But
it's not the same when they're hills.
No, but it's such good. It's when you get to the top of that hill, you're like, I did it. It's fun.
So do you ever watch like bike racing? Like I feel like Tour de France just ended recently. There was the road race at the Olympics. Did you watch the road race at the Olympics? It was basically an extension of the Tour de France, actually.
Yeah, we watched the whole Tour de France. So many crashes.
Oh yeah.
This year. I think that inspired us to bike even more. Like we watch it, and then because we DVR'd it, and then like, we gotta go.
It's funny, as a distance runner, I never. I mean, in Austin, it was such a big deal because at the time, Lance Armstrong was such a big deal before his big fall. But
yeah,
and people would watch it outside. There was like watch parties at night to watch the tour and all that stuff, and it seemed like a big deal. But I never really got into it until more recently, and I'm still not quite into it. But we watch from time to time, and it's fun. I like to watch the scenery and all that stuff too. It's like from the helicopter when they're showing the cyclists. That's some of the best parts is kind of what you see. And I think that's part of cycling as well. When you go into these areas outside of town or even in town, I used to do this like 18-mile loop inside of San Francisco I liked, but it was also a lot of hills in there too.
Yeah, no, that's why I like watching it, is you get to see either the French countryside or the little towns, and the people are so excited, and the kids, and it's fun to watch. But like you're saying, I have a city loop too that I do just in San Francisco, and going out to Lake Merced, and I've been adamantly following the Great Highway.
Right.
So, because I do bike on it during the week too. So now it's going to be opened back up, and this whole notion of biking on the bike lane on the Great Highway is like, I probably won't go to Lake Merced anymore. I'll just stop and cut my bike trip.
Were there other routes that you could take to go there on this like side streets or anything?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. There's just parts of it that I just don't feel safe.
Yeah, and it's disconnected,
yeah,
right?
It's really pretty much, yeah.
That's my loop. My loop, when I used to do the loop, probably start doing it again, but when I used to do the loop, it was mostly bike lanes and trails and going through the panhandle of Golden Gate Park, and there's a route I could take to go through the Wiggle and all that stuff. So most of the loop that I took was mostly protected, but I think that's a lot of, at the time anyways, this is in the last 10 years or so, it was the only places where you could actually get protected lanes and things like that. And especially when the Embarcadero changed over, that was a big deal too. So, but it does get frustrating when you are in the same traffic with cars, or you have like a little section where you have to like go into traffic to get to the next protected section. It's annoying.
Well, especially on the Great Highway, because cars are going faster. It's not, the speeds are faster on the Great Highway than other streets, because people are using it as a way to get across the city. It's not a neighborhood street. Right. In the Presidio, there's a lot of streets that have been closed down. Obviously, in Golden Gate Park, you can get through the whole park on a closed street. So that's fun. I hope that those remain closed.
And for those that might not be familiar, the Great Highway is basically the road that's next to the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco, and it's constantly has to be cleaned. The sand has to be cleaned off of it, and it's used as kind of a thoroughfare for a lot of drivers. But they closed it off during the pandemic because of social distancing, and people have really loved it. And the only people that don't love it are the drivers that want to get back on the road. And so they've made a quote unquote compromise. I don't know. We keep making compromises or bipartisan deals these days that don't seem to be a compromise or bipartisan in that respect. But so there's a deal made with the mayor and Gordon Moore, or I think somebody called him Gordon Carr. That was kind of funny on Twitter to open it up back on weekdays and then close it on weekends, I guess, which was really frustrating because we can do things that make change and incrementally and kind of get more people biking and walking, and people use that space like you did a lot. And, just for a couple of drivers to ruin that, because they have plenty of other routes where they could drive a car in the city, but there aren't a lot of other routes that you can actually bike continuously without feeling like you're going to get hit by a car.
Yeah. And they had closed only half of it. So half of it was still open for cars.
Yeah, and you had to just take a left off of it. Yeah.
So it's the great compromise, not really.
Well, I worry, and I think other people worry that this is going to open up the opportunity for them to start discussing opening up JFK, which is in Golden Gate Park, and other things, and things that certain supervisors have wanted to do for a while, but just they haven't gotten the political will to because they've been such pushback. But we need to close more. I actually, this Thursday on the podcast is going to be Chris and Melissa Bruntlett in their book, their most recent book called Curbing Traffic. And I wish that a lot of people could read the book, especially lawmakers, because it's this amazing kind of treatise of their lives in Delft, in the Netherlands, now that they've left Vancouver, BC, which is, Vancouver is known as a very forward thinking planning city, but going to Delft in a place where the car isn't king has just kind of changed their mental health situation and everything. It's crazy. And so I hope folks will listen to the show on Thursday because we talk about that stuff a lot. But I just feel like if we could get to a situation where we're dependent less on cars, it would be good for everybody in every way. So and this whole thing popping up this week after I talked to them last week, it's just been even more frustrating because we can't seem to get that to go. And even in a city like San Francisco.
I was happy, for example, when the mayor made the parklet and street area program permanent. That was great. But that's just such a basic part of improving our streets and making our streets more active and inviting. It's sort of like the lowest common denominator part. Having slow streets or streets with protected bike lanes or adequate space for people walking, that's what we're striving for. And just to say, well, we have parklets or, streeteries or, it's great, but that's the basic, that's what we can get.
Yeah.
We can't get up here what would it take to transform our streets?
Yeah. And those are destinations, right? And it goes back to this thing we say a lot, which is, going to places instead of through places. Mm-hmm. And I think we all keep on making places to go to, but then we have to go through other places to get to them. And a lot of people use their car to go through, and that's frustrating to a certain extent. Again, I'm not saying that we should just I'm not going to be as militant as saying we should get rid of all cars, because it's not realistic, especially when I was up in the Russian River Valley. There's no way to get around without it's like every hour or every 2 hours for your bus. And there's no way to get around there. So there's definitely a need for it. And the other funny thing is there's no cell phone service either in a lot of this area. So
no,
you're not going to be able to call an Uber or anything like that. So.
Or check your bus app. Yeah, you can't penalize or tell people that don't have reliable transit or biking or walking options that they shouldn't drive. You're not giving them something that would allow them not to drive. So,
right. But we're in the city.
So we do that, yeah.
In the 7x7 city, we have very good options. You can get places pretty quickly with transit. If it has good service and we get back to pre-pandemic levels of service too, that's another issue. And we could use a whole podcast on that, I'm sure. But well, let's get going. This is episode 94. We are in session. Before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and not so sure about Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. And thanks again to the folks that subscribe through the podcatchers. It's great that you all keep coming back and listening to this show. We really appreciate it. Yeah, and also Thursday, like I said, we're going to have Chris and Melissa on, so definitely listen to that episode. And last week's episode, too, with Dr. V. Kelly Turner about heat. And if you haven't heard that one, I learned so much about heat from that one in cities. It's amazing. So check it out if you get a chance. Okay, the news. Here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. The first one is cities didn't go anywhere after the pandemic. So for millennia, cities have been a target of disdain, but they have never failed to be the center of commerce and culture. Emily Badger explores why some thought or even hoped the pandemic would be the final blow to American cities, as well as also how cities are viewed differently around the world. So this was in the New York Times. Emily Badger, before she went on her much needed leave, family time, wrote couple of last articles before she went, but this is one of them. And I think this one kind of hit close to home. There's so many people that wanted cities dead during the pandemic. And I feel like a little bit of a Monty Python, not dead yet. So what did you take out away from this piece from Emily a couple of weeks ago?
So I think it's about this whole narrative around this, as Emily says, the prophecy is, why is it so alluring to talk about the death of cities? It's a narrative that just plays so well here in our political system, in a country that is mostly majority suburban. There's a lot of people that live in suburbs, and they, have this notion of what cities are that just we know isn't true. But I think it's a winning narrative for this whole place we're in, where it's us versus them. And even the New York Times has written plenty of articles where they talk about American cities are losing their allure and dying. So I'm glad that Emily Badger wrote this article to, take some of that narrative away. But the way that our congressional seats are gerrymandered, our Senate favors rural states, our electoral college means it's more difficult for Democrats and Democratic leaders in cities to win. It's just like this anti-city crowd. So you end up with all these talking points that are about degrading cities, because people represented in our leadership, national leadership, they're not from cities. And then you end up with policies like building a bunch of highways through Black neighborhoods like we have done over, in the 60s and 70s. And that just played into that narrative. It's a winning narrative if you're going out and trying to get votes in certain districts, and you can have your talking points on certain news channels.
From a political standpoint, I think that's true. I think Professor, I think it was David Schleicher, I think he's at Yale Law School, said in the article, actually, he's like, nobody said that London's over or Paris is over or other big cities are over. I'm sure there actually were people that probably said that, maybe in in rural France, but probably not to the degree that maybe people here in the United States do, because of, like you said, the political system that's in place that's really favoring rural and suburban areas over urban areas, even though urban areas are starting to grow and take more of a share. I think because of that sorting that we have, that people will move into cities, but they concentrate their power, and it doesn't translate to the electoral system like you're talking about, the gerrymandering and all that stuff. So cities have power in their own right from an economic standpoint, from their own standpoint, but they don't necessarily have power from a federal or a national standpoint, or even a state standpoint many times. Yeah. And so they get, walked over to a certain extent. And I think you're seeing this in places like Texas, where a lot of the cities, for example, Austin, want to do mask mandates because they're having a really bad time with the coronavirus, and their hospitals are code red. They're worried about not having any hospital beds anymore, and the governor is just saying, I'm gonna prosecute you if you have a mask mandate or anything along those lines in public health. So there's that type of thing too. I think another interesting thing that Emily mentioned in the story was the idea that cities are over, and that it's a convenient conclusion if you've decided that they're over for you specifically.
Yes.
So you see all these articles of people are like, I'm done with the city, I'm leaving, and this is why. And I'm like, okay, bye, see you later. Like, I get it. You don't want to be here anymore, and that's fine. You have the choice to leave. And I don't need to read any more of your stories about it, though, because I'm not ready to leave. I'm here, and so are the rest of us. And because it didn't work for you doesn't mean it doesn't work for other people, which it gets me every single time those pieces come out.
Well, and where is that? Why don't we get to write those articles? And, I think it's people, even people I know who think, whoa, what is going on in San Francisco? The streets are overrun with drugs. We're seeing this on our local news. And it's like, no, it's one of the most beautiful cities, most inviting cities you could live in the country. Why don't you come here and see what's going on, because it's not being overrun with drugs on every corner. Are there problems in cities? Of course, there's problems everywhere. I think, like you're saying, this narrative in general isn't true, but I think it's up to cities also to combat some of that narrative by making them more affordable. We can't just complain that there's this narrative out there, because just like you said, people who want to leave can, and they will, and that's fine. But if we want to make our cities a better place, the planning commission can't make an ice cream shop pay $200,000 to open, or stop a 50-unit building, affordable housing going up in the sunset. The school district can't close schools for a year and not have a plan to open them. All they're doing is feeding into the narrative and making it harder for people or working families to stay. So I think it's up to us too to combat that with actual progressive action on all of these basically dumb issues that we fight about all the time.
There's a lot of times where I'll see a piece and I'll scroll through Yahoo News or whatever, because it has just such a variety of items, and I'll see one from a certain outlet, and I just want to go outside and take a picture of my street and be like, man, it's so horrible here today.
I know. Look at this beautiful sunset over these cypress trees. And
the fog's coming in. Well, it must be frigid and cold and horrible.
That air that's so clean.
Yeah, the other day, and that's the other sad thing right now. It's happening in California is all the wildfires. But the other day, we because of the fog, we had zeros on all of the air quality monitors. And anything below 50 is pretty good for the most part in terms of the air quality index. But we had zeros, and I was like, "Wow, this is amazing! Like we can be here, and there's these crazy fires going
all
on
over it, around us,
all around us, and we can have this." We can have this such clean air and such good place to live. And I wish more people could live here. Obviously, we've discussed this before in terms of density and getting more people and allowing more housing. But it's hard because of the politics. But we try. We do our best. I wrote something in my newsletter when Emily wrote this piece, and I kind of wanted to share some of it. I'll start off this way. I said, my suspicion, much like the comment from Emily's article, is that the city they lived in was either not for them originally or was now over for them. That's perfectly understandable. Though for those of us who live in cities, the preaching and Medium posts saying, I'm leaving X city because get tiresome. Some of the earliest thoughts about cities in the Bible or in other works are about their hedonism and violence. Cities are places where wealth was hoarded and cults were formed. And if you want to look for these things, you can find them anyways. So that's just kind of my thoughts on that specific idea of the city is dying. The city is dead. Long live the city, I guess we should say.
Yes. I'm actually reading, I don't know how, I haven't read this yet, but Devil in the White City.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just so interesting that there was the narrative back then too. And people, it's just ongoing, as Emily talks about in her piece. Yeah,
exactly.
And it'll continue.
Yeah. Well, I'm as you know, I'm going through The City in History by Lewis Mumford, and it started really early on, of 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. It was one of those things that started and was looked at negatively. It was cities, but they also were a place of economic might and power. So you can win and you can lose. All right. A new metric for safer streets. New research from the University of Pennsylvania looks at using biometric data from pedestrians and cyclist cognitive workload evaluations to understand how these road users process information for safety. Areas of high workload are likely to create a higher crash threat. The benefit of using this measure is understanding dangerous intersections before they result in collisions or fatalities. This was by Erica Brockmeyer at PennToday, the University of Pennsylvania's news wing. So I thought this was really fascinating. I know you are looking at a lot of ways to measure streets and cities. That idea of using cognitive workload to measure whether somebody's stressed out and how much impact that has on their fear or their ability to stay safe in an intersection. I thought that was really fascinating. I don't know if you got a chance to take a look at this one.
Yeah, there were two things I thought were interesting. Is one, it didn't matter whether you experienced stress or some kind of stress at an intersection. It didn't matter your skill level.
Mm-hmm.
You could be an experienced cyclist, you could be a beginner, and the way you experienced that intersection was very similar. So when we talk, like the article talks about, we focus so much on education when really it's about design. But like you're saying, I've really been collecting all kinds of data on the right of way, on the curb. And traditionally, we always do collect data like parking or like vehicles or bikes or whatever. It's like a point in time. So if you're doing a parking study, you'll go at 10 o'clock. What does this look like? 11 o'clock. How many spaces are full? Or how many people on bikes do you see, or commercial deliveries? But using cameras and video analytics, we're collecting data every 10 seconds and every minute at the minimum, and every 10 seconds for the most part. And it is just opening up this like labyrinth of insights, because we're finding that our curbs and our streets have so much more capacity than we thought when we just collected point in time data. So that's like more capacity for people focused things. And, where people said, our parking is 100% full. It really isn't. When you look at the data across the hour, then just looking at, we checked it at 10:05 and it was full. Well, at 10:15, maybe it was only 60% full. So I just think that allows us to be more proactive. And it's the same here, where you're actually looking at taking a proactive approach to looking at design. And it's just interesting what technology will be able to do. Now, it's the thing is, like, you have to pay for this, you have to have cities have people on staff that can mine all this data. I mean, in over 3 weeks, I think I was talking about our last show, I collected 13.2 million pieces of data in just like 17 cameras. So we spent a lot of time doing all that analysis for a recent city. I don't know if that they could have done it on their own, but that's on the city side, like all the capacity that they're going to need to really get these insights.
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting point about data collection and also processing. I mean, there's all these, and I had a piece in the newsletter last week. There's all these data farms where people in other countries around the world are spending like $1. They're getting $1 an hour just to process all of the the autonomous vehicle data that comes in. Whether this is a cat or whether this is a dog or that's a road sign of that sort. So you have to process this stuff, which makes it harder. But also, I mean, if you can get to a point where the cameras can process it and maybe the cameras can determine maybe what causes human stress, and you kind of know that, it might be interesting to kind of tame this on an intersection and say, what is the stress of this intersection? Can you rate it by stress and like maybe figure out ways to do better design through that kind of assessment, maybe some sort of a way to, make some sort of a coding system or something. I don't know, but it seems like there's opportunities there for safer intersections before they become unsafe or before they cause collisions through this research and through all the data that we're collecting.
Yeah, and the cameras, so that's the technology I'm testing is if you have the cameras, can the analytics, and either that's analytics after you collect the footage, but some camera systems do edge technology where they're collecting it continuous in real time that you can see. I mean, it's also new. That's basically what we're testing to see how accurate it is, and we're reviewing it manually too. Just really fun.
I'm sure.
But yeah, it's I think that's where the industry is trying to go. I mean, again, there are so many considerations on the city side, and especially in terms of privatization and all of this all these policy issues. But I think it can really open up and make things easier for us to design, and it also can provide backup. So you can actually go to council or planning commission and say, no, this is what we saw. It's not just what we think.
Right. And hopefully they'll understand that when they when you tell them, hey, this intersection looks stressful. Does it look stressful to you? Let's fix it. Okay, so I got two final pieces before we get into this kind of infrastructure bill miasma. There's so much to talk about for that. But there's two pieces from Slate that I wanted to chat about briefly. The Segway was the future until it wasn't. At the turn of the century, an inventor came up with an idea. Now, that's weird that I say the turn of the century because before it was like the 19th to 20th century. Now it's the 20th to 21st century. It's weird. At the turn of the century, an inventor came up with an idea he thought everyone would steal, so he kept it secret. The problem was you can't market a secret idea, and the hype of the unknown often leads to a letdown. That was the story of the Segway, an invention that was the future of in the mind of many, but failed to deliver. And that was by Dan Coy in Slate. And then also there was an article in Slate. These are two Slate articles. Using a bike for transportation is ready for a day in the sun, but depictions of bike riders in popular media like movies and TV haven't kept up with that reality. So there's a whole article about how kind of stop making bike riders look like dorks, basically. So I think those two actually went together because that's kind of the result of the Segway to a certain extent. It got dorkified and people saw it as this nerdy thing. And I think part of it was, I don't know if you dove deep into the article, it was kind of a long one.
It was long, but it was
pretty good.
Yeah.
But it got dorkified because it was like the inventor was so secretive about it. He was like thought it was going to change the world. Even like big tech moguls like Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos thought this thing was going to change the world. They even wanted to give him millions of dollars to invest in this thing.
And he said no.
And he said no. But what happened is that he kept it secret for so long that people were just kind of meh when it came out, right? They were just like, oh, this was the big thing you were talking about, going to change the world? No, it's like a nerdy scooter that people can ride. And so I thought that was interesting about the idea of kind of hype and how that can kind of make or break a technology in certain ways. If it kind of sneaks up on you, it might actually be better than if it's like you're told that it's going to be great and then it turns out to be different than what you expected.
Yeah, it's sort of like when Burden just threw a bunch of scooters in cities and, college kids love them. Yeah, I thought the Segway article was so interesting because I remember when Segways first came out, they were it's not something I would have ever had the chance to use or ride. I didn't even know where to buy one or like, and even when they came out, you couldn't purchase one for a year.
Yeah. They were expensive too. They were like $5,000 a piece or something.
Yeah, they were expensive. They were also so advanced. Like if the article goes into this, if the battery died and you had to repair it, you basically needed machine technology to get the cap off, because they were planning for water, rain events and everything else. So they were trying to make it so high tech and so, incombustible that they made it too high tech. And one thing I liked about the article is it talks about when Dan, who the author, he goes into a Segway rental place in DC, and he rents a Segway and he's talking about how exciting it was to ride it. But then he goes back and he's talking to the owner about the article and explaining, what happened with the Segway. And the owner of the shop said, well, you had to have a dumb person in the room to keep things on the level. You had all these smart people designing this Segway, but you didn't have a person in there that thought, well, how is someone going to actually use this? And so the narrative around it was all this hype, but not actually implementation of, the user.
And also in terms of marketing and stuff like that, like he distrusted the marketers. He thought they were like horrible people and didn't understand anything. And I'm like, well, those are the people that you need to kind of sell your ideas. And I guess he'd gotten so lucky early on with his first invention, which I guess was some sort of an electronic device for medical situations. It was really high tech, and I think people use it everywhere now. And he made just a ton of money off of it. But he was just a really brilliant guy, but he just didn't have that kind of awareness generally of what people. How people would react to things. Sometimes you need somebody extra in the room to tell you whether it's a good idea or whether it's going to flop horribly.
Well, that's what even one of the designers said. They had a sketch of the, single wheel skateboard things that kids, well, I see them a lot actually on the streets here.
The hoverboard
and they
things?
the hoverboards. And they, at the time, were joking like, who would ride that? And that's actually something that people do ride. I see, like I said, we see it all the time. And it really was the Segway, it was the precursor to scooters and, electric scooters, electric bikes. That's easier to implement and what people want to ride. The article also pointed out that when, they were interviewing cities about why they did or didn't purchase Segways. They said, well, it could be fine for like parking enforcement, but it's a lot cheaper just to buy some bikes. And, why would we buy a $5,000 Segway that, runs on a battery and you have to constantly charge it. And
it was over-engineered for sure.
Yeah. But I mean, he's a pretty fascinating guy. I mean, he's like, had his own country in New Hampshire on an island. He's met all the presidents.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this nerdification thing too. I mean, that was another piece that we brought up that was kind of related, because at the end of the article they talk about obviously Paul Blart Mall Cop and kind of the Job and Arrested Development and those kind of characters that were using Segways, and then it kind of gave it a negative or at least a nerdy connotation. But bicycles have had this kind of nerdy connotation for a long time too. Or I think the auto industry and their marketing might has kind of pushed out a narrative that if you're riding a bike, you're not cool. You need to buy a car. And unfortunately, that's kind of a dominant narrative. And so you see these depictions in pop culture and other areas of people riding bikes as nerds and dweebs and people that are of lower status, which is not true necessarily, if at all. And it's frustrating, I think, for a lot of us who do ride bikes and, maybe want to push a little further on that auto centricity narrative. I think something like the Great Highway, kind of what happened there is kind of a result sometimes of this. People that ride bikes are just mammals. They're the people that are riding on the weekends with their spandex and not actually using it to get around the city.
Yeah, I think The first movie I thought of when I started reading this article was This Is 40, where Paul Rudd's just, in the full Lance Armstrong, fighting with cars all the time and eating sprinkles cupcakes. That's like the nerdification of it. But I also, did you watch the HBO show High Maintenance?
Mm-mm.
It's, the guy on High Maintenance is cool. He's actually selling drugs, but that's a whole different element. But
Okay.
in Brooklyn, he's selling like pot, which is legal now in New York. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, he gets around on his bike, and it's like he's going to parties. He's like portrayed as a cool guy. It's really the only show I've seen where someone biking is portrayed in like a totally different light than either they're poor, they can't afford a car, they're like having a midlife crisis and buying spandex, all these other narratives.
Or like a meltdown, like I Heart Huckabees, like Mark Wahlberg's character, or like the 40-year-old virgin, right? Like seen as uncool.
Napoleon Dynamite,
which I mean, that's pretty cool. They can do the jumps off the bike, but yeah, it's just like it's seen as kind of a negative thing. Maybe we should lobby for more bikes in sitcoms or something like that, like to get places, just without making a big deal out of it. Just be like, okay, we're going to do this thing. Yeah. Well, it's funny, when I first got my bike, I have a city bike, and it's a nice Linus. When I was first riding around the city, I went to get some pants at Banana Republic or something like that. And I went outside, and there's people taking pictures, and they asked me if they could borrow my bike. It was like a model. It was like there was actually a photo shoot type of thing. Right. So, and they asked me if they could use my bike. I was like, yeah, sure. And so, they took pictures with it, and it was like a cool thing. And I was like, oh, well, maybe this means that bikes are going to become cool again. And I actually didn't ever see the pictures, the end result or anything like that. But I was hoping maybe maybe my bike would be the start of a revolution.
Revolution?
Yeah, something like that.
With models and
yeah, because there was a guy model and there's a women and man model, and they all had like fancy clothes on, and it was in Union Square in San Francisco, and they took my bike and used it as a prop, as like like leaning
Very
up against the
cool.
bike. And so I was like, oh well, this is the thing, and then I never saw anything else. So maybe it didn't start the revolution I hoped it would.
But biking is cool in places like in the Netherlands. It's just like normal.
The only way to be.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. We'll get there eventually, I hope. It'd be nice.
Yeah.
All right. Next up, Infrastructure Rama. So one of the things that fills me with dread about talking about current events on the podcast is the fact that it'll probably be different the next day.
They're voting tomorrow. They're voting in a couple hours.
Right. They're as soon as you listen to this, they might have already voted. And obviously these come out at Monday night late, and then you can listen to it on Tuesday, or if you're up late, you can listen to the show. But yeah, I always worry. And the IPCC report came out this morning. Obviously, climate change is such a big thing. And then tomorrow they'll probably have the vote for the infrastructure bill. So we're going to talk about this, even though something might happen tomorrow. And if it's vote yes, and then they just push it to the House, and it kind of probably going to sit there for a little while anyway. So that's my caveat before we get to talking about this. This might be out of order before you get to it, but that's okay, because this bill is out. There's been amendments. They've voted for cloture. They're pushing it to a final vote, which it's amazing. Actually, I can't believe that they actually did this. I thought it was going to die on the vine, and we were going to get a really good reconciliation bill. But alas, we get a crappy infrastructure bill, and perhaps a good reconciliation bill if Nancy can keep it all together. But yeah, what are you thinking right now about this bill and its process? And we've talked about this obviously 2 or 3 times on the show. What's the lowdown from your end?
Well, I think no matter what happens tomorrow, it's what I find most interesting is, again, it's with the narrative that we keep talking about, but it's the narrative among people like us on Twitter, advocates, how different it is from the narrative coming out of the rest of the country, on the nightly news, on the local news. Like listening to the to the Sunday shows yesterday, you would think this bill is super progressive, and the biggest investment in transit and rail ever, and President Biden is saying that it's the biggest transit investment in American history. We are talking about trillions of dollars. And I would say like those are big numbers. And it does show you, especially with the reconciliation, if it does get to 3.5 trillion, it does show you where progressives have moved the needle. But I also think when the American Jobs Plan was announced, we just had these hopes that, I mean, obviously we knew it would get compromised down, but then we thought we're going to have this bill of this transportation bill that is going to have meaningful impact on climate and land use and like eliminate a lot of the injustices and inequality, and that's just not there. But the president can say he got something done. He cares about bipartisanship. And in this environment, he can come out and say he did it. And for a country that is moderate, that doesn't, we don't want to change our behaviors. We don't want to really make any meaningful changes that will change the course of what's going on with our planet and our climate, and our political leaders don't want to ask us to make those changes. So that's where we're at. And it was put together without any transportation experts on the G20. So we're here, and this is where we landed.
We're going at the speed of DC, which is slow.
Yes.
We could probably ride a bike next to them as they go.
We could walk.
We could probably walk, actually. We could probably hang out with our pet turtle who's walking next to them. Somebody said today, I can't remember where it was, maybe it was the Atlantic or something, and it was like, this is not what the progressives wanted, but ultimately you are moving that needle slowly. And progressive is a strange term. I have a weird relationship with the term progressive because of San Francisco politics and all that stuff. But,
yes, I agree.
But on a national level, let's just say generally, I'm going to say that I'm probably to the lefter of left for many things. But for the progressives, you move the needle a little bit each time, and if you get your accessibility amendment called woke, and if you get your if somebody calls this a mini Green Deal, then maybe then you actually did do something, because going at the speed of slow in DC, it's hard to turn an aircraft carrier, right? And so I have been kind of down on the bill after all this Gang of 10 stuff started happening, because I know that the 10 whitest people in the world were crafting a bill that obviously wasn't paying attention to what the climate was going through and what people in cities are going through. But like you said, there's a moderating factor that's just kind of inherent in our political system that keeps it going this way. So I don't want to be happy about it, but I'm going to be optimistic about it, I guess I should say. It's maybe a different term of phrasing, and hoping that in the reconciliation bill there's more stuff that's done. But at the end of the day, there's little changes in there that are interesting. The VMT pilot project, for example, it's a good thing, and it's good that was pushed by the conservative lawmakers, because it's already been called a surveillance state act, and it's been called horrible things. But I guess it was Bill Cassidy or somebody who wrote part of that piece was like, you guys are crazy. So
yeah,
and if it was our side, if it was the liberal side saying that, it would not ever get anywhere. So I'm okay with getting your odometer checked once a year. It's not a big deal. It's not going to change anything, and it'll also make people who drive electric cars pay for the highway trust fund, which, good or bad, some of that goes to transit. You need to do it. So
yeah, I think I agree with you on the things that we need to do to really address climate change. Our government is just not set up to do that. The UN report that was released today, that's going to require serious transformational action, and Congress does not operate in that way. It's always incremental, and some very small minorities can stop policies that will benefit a lot, the majority of people. Like, I worked on two transportation bills, MAP 21 and FAST, and getting things like pairing the transit commuter benefit with the parking benefit. You would have thought we were asking people for their firstborn child. I mean, it was, or like setting out national goals for our transportation system. These were very, very high level, just like our transportation system should do, like benefit the environment or, move people around like that. That was so difficult to get. But I agree, there's some real meat in this bill that can improve our communities, improve the environment. There's $73 billion to modernize the nation's electricity grid. I mean, that's a serious investment, and that's what we need to do first before we can set up these, 500,000 chargers across the country, or have transit agencies have the electric vehicles. I think there's some other things in there, like the new SMART program for pedestrian infrastructure. The fact that Secretary Buttigieg has control over $124 billion in competitive funds, that's like huge. I mean, that's where the department can really pick and choose programs and have a say in what gets funded. I mean, I think there's a lot of things, like we're spending $3 billion on programs to reduce wildfire risk, but we're also, allowing more highways and roads. I mean, this is where it's all about the compromise and what you can get done and what you just simply can't. But I think there is some real meat in there that is positive, and like you said, it can be hopeful that it will make an impact.
Well, it's kind of like Beth Osborne has been saying, is like, the amount of money doesn't necessarily matter. It's what you do with it. And so I think some of the policy stuff is lacking, but there are a few things in there that can help. It doesn't help when you're building a new freeway, I-14, between Georgia and the Permian Basin where all the oil is. But maybe they can actually start doing. There's a lot of windmills out there too, so maybe that's the windmill highway. Maybe we can call it something good rather than what it actually is. But yeah, I mean, I can understand where DeFazio, who is the House T&I chairman, they wrote this amazing invest bill, which I think a lot of progressives, and it even passed the House, right? Through, obviously it was on a partisan basis, but it passed the House and people voted for it, and it has a lot of guardrails for making sure that if a state DOT wants to spend money, they have to do it on Fix It First. They have to do repairs and fixes for bridges and those types of things, which didn't make it in the Senate because they just didn't want to. They didn't want to go through the details because they knew that the other side was just going to yell and scream. So they kind of gave up on that just to make it bipartisan, it's really sad because there's so much good stuff, and maybe we'll get some of that stuff in a reconciliation bill. I'm not sure, but there's a lot of good that can come out of just simple policy changes to make sure that we're spending our money in a way that's not wasteful. And I'm not talking about, more for transit or anything like that, but if we're going to have $110 billion or 100 whatever billion dollars for roads, it shouldn't be for road expansion. I mean, the IPCC report and all the stuff that I've been depressing maybe my newsletter readers a little bit lately, because on the environment section, I've been really getting dark. Just because of all the stuff.
There's a lot of dark.
It's just because of all the stuff that I've been seeing. I mean, the loss of monarch butterflies, the shifting of the current that takes all the warm air to England, all of the melting glaciers and the problems with the bugs that have decreased in population by 75%. Even though people don't like insects, they're really important to our ecosystem. So all this stuff starts to add up in my brain a little bit and start to kind of permeate. We were in the Russian River, obviously, and there's a little bit of sadness there because we only have about 5% of the redwood forests we used to have. We cut them all down they're probably part of this house that I'm sitting in, actually. But we need to grow a lot of that back, but it's hard because the climate's changing in such a way that the fog that sustained them doesn't come maybe as often as it used to. And so, we have a lot of rebuilding to do in our ecosystem, and it can be sad. It can be sad. And so when you see this bill and they're talking, the IPCC report comes out and then they're talking about like, oh, this great bipartisan compromise. I'm like, what does it matter if the planet's gone. Like, and that's just the darkness, the dark, side that I go to. Even though I am optimistic, I do believe we can turn the tables. And the IPCC report isn't all negative, right? They say we can actually fix it and make it, stop. We can only get to 1.5. Not we don't have to go to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, but we can stabilize it if we do all the right things. But doing the right things, that's the thing that this bill could have done, but doesn't quite. But it like I said, it moves the needle a little bit in that direction. Like you said, the energy grid is really important. There's little things in there that are going to be important. Whatever happens in the reconciliation bill with a clean energy standard, those types of things that make sure that we aren't just building electric cars and driving electric cars for point source pollution, but we're actually fueling them with alternative energy. Those types of things are the little piece by piece that we need to put together, but it's hard when you see such a collapse of ecosystems and some stuff like that, the rainforest and whatnot. It starts to get kind of my brain goes 2 different directions. It splits and then it comes back together again. And I'm trying to go forward, and sometimes I go back.
Well, if you look at recent polling, even on what are the issues that Americans see as the most critical to the future, climate change is ranking higher and higher. Mm-hmm. But when you ask people what they actually want to do to address climate change, it's electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, electric vehicles are great, but they're not zero emissions. So we really need microgrid, like you're saying, solar, wind technology to power those electric vehicles. If you want to have zero emissions, and they do really nothing, they're still cars. They do nothing for the land use or community engaged, development or that our cities need. But I think that this is always the best. I mean, it is the best we can get when you have a Congress that you're just kind of stuck with. You don't have 50 votes. Sinema and Manchin, they were the 2 loudest, but there were also many moderates that don't want to do the things that we want. And I think I heard Senator Durbin over the weekend say, this is the best deal we can get. And this is bipartisan, and all of our transportation bills have been bipartisan. And that is why we end up with the status quo that we have, because, we always strive to have this bipartisanship, and you get sometimes just watered down status quo things that really don't make the transformational effect you can when you're spending this much money. I mean, I think within the budget reconciliation bill, as I understand it, President Biden said anything that was negotiated in the infrastructure bill would not be part of the budget reconciliation. So that does give an opportunity, if they are going to spend 3.5 trillion or some trillion amounts, what can they do there with the CAFE standards, with real investments in other programs that would really have an impact on the climate. But we'll see. I mean, that's starting to come out now.
It came out today.
Started to come out today. A lot of like healthcare, child tax credits, universal pre-K, like all the human infrastructure things we've been talking about. But it's also going to take new taxes to pay for that. So that's obviously a landmine, for Democrats too.
Yeah, I know, but it's still like, I think I saw a number that was like they could raise 700 million alone from just taxing, the corporate profit statements that companies put out to their investors by 1% or something like that. Whatever it is like 3% or something like that. It's like such a small, minuscule amount for these large corporations that nobody's gonna like cry over, except for the lobbyists for those companies. Nobody's gonna complain about taxing Amazon, for example. And so I think there's a populist potential there to actually get some stuff done. I'd like to make another request too, that these bills that they write, that they come out with 2,700 pages, like it's only 2,700 pages because they have to write them in that stupid legal format. It's so hard to read. Like I sat down and I tried to start reading it because I was like, okay, I'm gonna find something in here that maybe like I hadn't seen or heard of before. And I was like, I give up because it's so stupid hard to read. They need to make 2 different types. They need to make the legal type, which I know they need for law and all that stuff, but they need to make like the dumb person's version, which is not lawyers reading through it. Cause it's like therefore so
Therefore,
outstick
this
this
shall,
this shall
yeah.
blah blah blah. It's like, I don't, stop the legal language. Like,
Yeah.
let's write a bill that like people can actually read, and it doesn't take a law
Well,
degree.
it's meant for,
I mean, it's meant to be legally
it's meant
binding.
to,
I understand.
well, it's meant for you not to be able to understand it.
Well, that too. I guess they're trying to obscure what they're actually doing in some of these bills.
But that's a good point, though, because the Senate used what they had from EPW and Commerce, because those were the two bills that were ready to go. And because it takes so long to draft these bills. So
because
Senate
of this language crap.
Yeah, because I write bill. It takes a long time to draft them. But because they had bills ready to go that had already passed the Senate, they were able to they just said, okay, we're going to use this. This is our mechanism. And whatever's in it is what we use.
But that's why DeFazio is going to be so upset, because he spent so much time to write the other bill. Write the other bill, which is like really good, and it has lots of really good stuff in it.
And he was just cut out. He was totally cut out.
Yeah. I mean, I would be upset if I were him too, but also just like any of the other, and you know, what's interesting now is because they're going to tie this up, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on Pelosi and the Democrats to push through the infrastructure bill without the reconciliation bill, because obviously the conservative side doesn't like the reconciliation bill, and a lot of the stuff that's in it. Also, before I get to that part of tying together those two bills, the other thing that bothers me is that all of the amendments for the infrastructure bill, like, I feel like there should be like a rule that if you can't make an amendment unless you end up voting for the bill, because all these people were throwing in amendments that they wanted added to the bill, even though they were like not even going to vote for it. So like, what's the point of giving you what you want in a bill that you're not going to vote for? And then you get to go home to your constituents and say, hey, I got this for you. And it's like, but you didn't vote for the bill and you didn't even want the bill. So how are you getting credit for it? Anyways, that's
get to slow down the process.
Yeah, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that, like the reconciliation bill, I mean, Pelosi said we're not gonna move on the infrastructure bill until we get this reconciliation bill going. And the progressive wing actually has a really good way to kill the bill if voting against it, obviously, because there's such a little bit of of a majority in the House. If the infrastructure bill gets too far ahead, or if people are pushing for that one without the reconciliation bill, they can just kill it outright and get rid of it, which I might not be too sad about if it actually happened. But I mean, there's guardrails to make sure that both of these things can get done, and get some progressive or more liberal legislation through that might have not have otherwise gotten through.
I think it would be really hard for progressives to vote against this bill. I mean, it has the forces of the Senate, the White House. I think Joe Biden would be apoplectic because he's tied his name to this bill. It's the Joe Biden.
But progressives put him in office also. I mean, all of the people that haven't gotten any of the voter rights stuff that they wanted, they put him in office too, and they've been screwing them over as well. So they're making a lot of people mad just for this stupid bipartisan bill, which a lot of people don't even like on the left side of the aisle. And so if they want to play that game, then they're going to get screwed. And I mean, it makes me really mad just thinking about like what all the stuff that people haven't got that they were promised. And so if this is a small thing to go down, I understand the pressure, but at the same time, they don't care.
But I think Joe Biden would say moderates put him in office. And if you've looked at the last few elections where moderates have won House seats, or he thinks the country is moderate, and he thinks the country wants to go back to this bipartisan. I mean, he's living in a world where he was in the Senate and it was bipartisan, and he could trust people and at their word, and that's what he thinks he's restoring. And I get that. I mean, I understand that, but you can't take the other side for granted. And I think that's part of the deal. You make the coalitions, and then you got to help the coalitions move forward. So, well, and it sounds like Speaker Pelosi, I mean, that she's committed to reconciliation, and what she's been saying is we are voting on reconciliation first. So she's committed to that. Yeah. I mean, but I mean, she has the moderates who want to vote on the infrastructure bill right now.
Right.
That's not going to happen, obviously, because she only has a 4-vote margin.
Right, because then she's going to lose all the progressive votes if they get put through the infrastructure bill. So she has to go the other direction.
She can't lose. Yeah, I mean, this can't.
Which is what I was saying. Right. So with that said, if you want to go and get a more detailed overview of the nuts and bolts of the infrastructure bill and what's in it, Jeff Davis of Eno Center has a really great webinar that they have on YouTube. I'll post it in our show notes. So people can go and check out if their preferred project or their preferred maritime funding got put into the bill. So we talk about some of the kind of higher level stuff and not necessarily go into the weeds, but there's a lot of stuff out there if you want to find out what's specifically in the bill. You can also read the bill, which I tried to, but it's like pulling teeth. So definitely there's a lot of stuff going on. You're going to find out probably this week more information than we are talking about on this podcast, but at the same time, hopefully there's some nuggets of information that might be of interest to everybody. So we'll get to the next section. Are you ready?
I'm looking for it.
Well, first, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We have people sign up each month during the pandemic, and we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month and you'll get some stickers and a handwritten note, and $10 a month and you'll get a bus-only scarf. So if you want one of the bus-only scarves, and you can do so by going to the website as well and purchasing one specifically. But I love when people become Patreon members at $10 a month and you sustain the podcast and the newsletter. We appreciate your help. Also, I want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. The book was super fun to produce, and we know that it's also American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books on Planning. It's the first one on the list. Go check it out in audio format if you haven't had a chance to read it. So listener questions and comments. We do have a listener question from July that I wanted us to answer together. So I'm going to read this out and then we can talk about it a little bit. The discussion on accessibility got me thinking about a question I have been mulling in my mind for a while. For some background, I am a car light family of 4, soon to be 5 in Chicago. We share one car with my sister, but only use it maybe once a week. Our predominant mode of transportation is by CTA and electric cargo bike. I often travel the CTA with my children and strollers. Doing this has gotten me to think about how difficult it is at times to traverse our system with a stroller. I've thought about how much harder it must be to actually have a disability and it had to navigate the public transit by wheelchair. Since having children, I've been much more supportive of upgrading our transit infrastructure to accommodate wheelchairs and strollers as well. I have also been supportive of improving bus service since it is easier to use strollers and wheelchairs than in our rail system. Anyway, this is not the question I wanted to ask today. Due to the challenge of taking transit with children and my desire to live very car light, we have begun to use our electric cargo bike much, much more. It has given our families so much freedom from a mobility standpoint as well as a financial standpoint. We now have electric cargo bikes that go up to 20 miles per hour. Do you know of any similar options for people with disabilities? If 20 miles per hour electric wheelchairs exist, I don't see a reason why people in wheelchairs can't also use a bike lane network to experience a similar freedom that our family experiences. With micromobility being such a hot topic today, have there been any discussions on micromobility options for people with disabilities? Love the show, Kevin. No. Thanks, Kevin, for writing in. Appreciate it. Sorry we're taking so long to get back to you. But my first thought on this is that in talking with Chris and Melissa about their book, Curbing Traffic, this last week, which is coming out on Thursday for folks that are listening, they have a whole chapter in the book called The Accessible City that kind of addresses this. And in Delft, because the bike network is so great, they actually have a friend who uses this thing called a scootmobile, which is basically an electric scooter. But she has MS and she can get around the city really easily because of the bike network and use her scooter to access the things that she would otherwise not be able to access, which is actually easier than getting in a car every time and trying to access it that way. So actually the accessible city from that standpoint is beneficial for people that are using those types of mobility devices. And so I think if we could design our cities in a better way, in a more accessible way, that would actually mean more bike lanes, more travel lanes for slow mobility, those types of things. And we could actually see the benefits of that for more types of users than just able-bodied users.
I always think you never experience how bad our pedestrian and bike infrastructure is until you can't, walk or, you know, on 2 feet, or, you know, you have to use some other device to get around. And I think it's like, until you experience it yourself, you just don't think about it. Or until you know, I've been in outreach events, and we're talking to people, and they say, oh, until I broke my leg, I didn't understand how sidewalk infrastructure, like trees and garbage cans or whatever it is, gets in the way of you trying to get even on a sidewalk, let alone having something in the road and a protected lane so that you can have your wheelchair go in the lane. But I think it's like, we just design transit for people. Well, we design our infrastructure based on people's backgrounds and experiences, and so many of those people don't have those backgrounds and experiences, or, you know, those. So I think it's cool that you actually have an answer, because I haven't. I mean, I think we need to do some more design where we have separated lanes and for more faster vehicles, slower vehicles. But, you know, so far that really hasn't happened.
There's so much stuff that's designed by just white cis male able-bodied people. And, you know, getting more experiences in the room is really important to have that discussion and make sure that it's designed for everybody, because ultimately you can't just, most of us are able-bodied. I mean, that's the quote unquote norm, right? It's not really a norm. It's just like kind of an average, a mean. And that's how things get designed, but there's 20% on each side that don't actually, 20 to 30% on each side that don't actually have that same norm. And so, we talked to Sarah Hendren about this on the show as well, with her book, What Can a Body Do? And there's a whole literature around it, which I think people should just definitely go and explore if they get a chance. So there's a larger discussion around this, but it's important discussion to have.
Yeah, I'm working with, there's an ITEI PMI committee that I'm on, that we're trying to look at the curb and accessibility for everybody and for non-able-bodied people, to figure out, like, just how do we instill design? How do we, like, advise cities on what they need to do to design the curb so that everyone has access? But again, I think you're right. When I was at Remix, we started this thing called Women in Urbanism and Women in Transit. And, it was about designing transit for women. And that's what Kevin was talking about, like even bringing a stroller on a bus, how difficult that can be, because there's not a lot of women in leadership positions in transit. So they're not thinking about it. And it's the same way. We just need to have more representation at the leadership level so that we actually design things that people can use.
Yeah. And it's been interesting to see the discussion of a care infrastructure through this whole infrastructure bill process. And we start talking about these different subjects, and it kind of blows people's minds. They're like, oh, maybe if we thought about it differently, care as infrastructure rather than just a social service or something along those lines, right? You kind of flip the script with our framing. Really interesting way to look at it. Okay, Puppies and Butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. Chrissy, what's your Puppies and Butterflies?
So my Puppies and Butterflies comes from Just Zimbabwe. Of Justin, they were on our election night show. So if you don't follow Just on Twitter, I would encourage you to. And back in July, she tweeted this thing out, and I bookmarked it because I thought it was so funny. She was having a dinner club, and the goal for the dinner club that night was to recreate a mid-century classic recipe. And her mid-century classic recipe was the tuna mold salad. And I would just encourage you to go look at this. She made these tuna mold salads it's like a tuna salad, but in these molds, and there were like potato chips and all these different, she found these recipes from, I don't know, like the 50s. There were crinkle fries, there was wishbone Italian dressing, all stirred up. There were some deviled eggs and pickles, and they really enjoyed it. She called it the Clean Plate Club, and the kids did not finish, so she loved it so much she also finished the kids' plates. So it was her Twitter feed is just a breath of fresh air during your day. I mean, she also tweets about like really important things, but yeah, she's a lot of comedic brilliance. So I would encourage everyone to go check her out.
There's definitely a lifestyle of comedy going on with with that family that I love following.
They also recently picked a cucumber that was as big as their firstborn. So.
Oh, I love hearing about the plants that overgrow. I think my Puppies and Butterflies is just generally the end of the Olympics, and not that I'm happy that it's over. I'm happy that it happened. There was obviously there's always a lot of politics and things that come from the Olympics, but I just have really good memories of my time when I went to London in 2012 and all the camaraderie, all of the sharing experiences with people from other countries, the idea that you can actually, have competition without it being war or angry or mean. And it's friendly. I mean, obviously they're serious about their competitions but there's lots of really good moments this Olympics of sportsmanship and people, putting aside differences and getting together to celebrate sport. And so I was really taken aback by Molly Seidel, the women's marathoner who got third in only her third marathon. And I just know that it made me actually choke up a little bit because as a runner who had Olympic aspirations at one point, I understand how much work went into her journey and every other Olympic athlete's journey. I think you see so much crying because they've put years and years of their life into something that's really important to them. And as somebody who's done something similar, I can feel the emotions come out of them, and it makes me emotional, and it makes me really happy that I had that experience in London, but also that I get to watch this every 4 years, every 2 years, really, with the summer and the winter Olympics. And I know obviously they're political and they have their problems with the IOC is like a jerk organization, and countries are asked to pay too much, which hopefully is being changed for Paris and LA. But at the base of it, there is something purely good about the Olympics, which I love. So I don't know how you feel about the Olympics, Chrissy, but I'm a huge fan.
Well, I love watching. It just makes you feel good to see the opening ceremonies and people that really are competing with everything they have. And like watching the gymnastics, you see the people from different countries giving each other hugs and high fives. And, it's so cool to see. And I think the Olympics too, I was in Japan I guess 2019. When they, I saw everything that was built in Tokyo for it. And it's obviously not this year, but it is just such an economic development boost, or should be, maybe not in Russia, but, should be for these countries to bring in tourism and, to build, like, we're talking about transformative infrastructure. There have been transit lines, lots of infrastructure that has been built because of the Olympics that have really improved the lives of people that live in those places. So, and I mean, we're not going to get into the IOC. That's not the discussion, but it's something that does bring us together, especially during times where it feels like the world is like just so in our corners, and it's the one place where people come together and to watch these athletes that, I mean, the stuff they're doing now, they're like breaking records every day because of the new technology. Like I saw on the track that it was the bounciest track and most responsive track ever. So they broke every world record.
Yeah, it's interesting what Mondo can do with tracks. But yeah, I'm just always blown away and happy that I get to kind of partake even from afar. I do at some point in the future, I want to go back because I just had such a great experience in London with what happened and just kind of hanging out with Brits in a pub, watching a 10K and everybody hugging afterwards. It's just some weird thing that happens every 4 years, every 2 years.
Yeah, it brings you together.
It brings you together.
Nice.
I have the last story I'll tell. I think I've probably told this on the show many times, and I tell everybody this story, but we were in the fencing arena in London at the Eno Center, and I think it was a Colombian athlete who'd won the first gold medal for the country in like 30 years or something like that in fencing. And there was some country of his countrymen were in front of us, and they had the flag, and they were very excited. And I don't think I've ever hugged a stranger for so long, so many times, because they were so excited to have a gold medal come back to their country. And it was just a moment of pure joy and happiness and it makes me cry now.
It makes you feel like you're part of something that's bigger, and brings you so close to a person.
Right. And just happiness. It's pure happiness. So I'll end with that note. Chrissy, where can folks find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at MantiniChrissy or at mycuriouscity.com.
And you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at theoverheadwire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thanks for Chrissy, as always, for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Jeff.
And we'll see you next time.
Talking